Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to go back 50 years to April 1973 and just remind ourselves what was going on in the Beatle world. It was quite an active month, actually, a lot going on, and I'm going to talk about some stuff which happened maybe a couple of months before and maybe a couple of months after as well. So 50 years, hard to believe. The first thing to say is on April the 2nd in the US, the Red and the Blue albums came out. These compilations, masterminded by Alan Klein by all accounts in terms of the track selection. A very important gateway to the Beatles for loads of people who were just a bit too young to have experienced it first time round. People like me, really, although I don't think I bought these albums at the time because I was too young, but I might well have done, and I still have a lot of memories of this album because friends of mine had it. And one can grumble about the track selection, but on the whole I think they've done a pretty fantastic job. The only thing I would say is, in particular, the Blue album is a bit difficult to listen to because it's got so many differing styles, and it's a bit difficult to go from Pepper to White Album, in my opinion. So I prefer to listen to the original albums, but those albums have a big place in Beatles history, and a wonderful gatefold picture from the sessions from the Mad Day Out, July 1968, St Pancras Gardens there with the Beatles hiding amongst members of the public. Actually visited St Pancras Gardens a few years ago and saw for myself the church, where they posed in front of, and the gate, which is probably not the same gate, but anyway, and the flowers and the bench they sat on and all that, and the fountain. Worth going if you're in the London area. So the other album, which came out this month, or more or less this month, 30th of April in the US, 4th of May in the UK, is Paul McCartney and Wings' Red Rose Speedway. So the long-awaited follow-up to Wildlife, it had been a while in the making, and it was originally going to be a double album, as we know. And what I would say is, I think it's very melodic, and I think maybe the lyrics let it down a bit in places, but it's a very sort of laid-back, uplifting album, in my opinion, and unpretentious, not taking itself too seriously. And yeah, should it have been a double? Well, I quite enjoyed that double album which came out the other year. Tracks like Country Dreamer would have been nice to have been on here, and I Would Only Smile and Seaside Woman. But on the other hand, there's some stuff which perhaps wouldn't have fitted on. I don't think we should have mixed live stuff with studio stuff, for example, like The Mess and Best Friend. If they're going to do those tracks, I think they should have gone into the studio and done a version of them. Anyway, it ended up as a single album, probably the right choice, because it got very high in the charts, number one in the US, I think. And actually, around this time, it was quite gratifying for Beatles fans, because you had the Red and the Blue at the top of the charts, and then replaced by Red Rose Speedway, and then a couple of weeks later replaced by Living in the Material World from George Harrison, which didn't come out until the 30th of May in the US, so we're a bit early to celebrate the 50th anniversary of this, but it had already been completed, and they were doing the packaging by this stage. And if you buy that Material World DVD, there's an extra on the CD, there's an extra DVD with a bit of footage of the pressing plant, the EMI pressing plant, sort of rolling off copies of Material World, one after the other. Very nice to see that. Haven't watched that in a while, actually. So, yeah, so that was those albums. And then now I wanted to read you some contemporary reviews from, this magazine came out collecting all the reviews from the NME and Melody Maker from the 70s, from the time the albums came out. And so I went straight to this page, which is the Red Rose Speedway and Material World albums, both reviewed by the same guy, Tony Tyler, who'd also reviewed the Sometime New York City album a few months before, Lennon, You're a Pathetic Revolutionary. And I just thought it was interesting and quite gratifying that it's different from the kind of norm, Because at the time, in the early 70s, Paul was getting slagged off and John and George were being lauded as some kind of almost gods in the rock world. And Tony Tyler takes John to task pretty strongly here. And he talked about the cover, and he doesn't like that. But then he says, now the lyrics themselves. I was groping for a single word to sum up their initial impression on me, and I arrived at insulting, arrogant, rigid, dogmatic. In short, the effect achieved was the opposite of the effect desired, brackets I hope. I finally settled on pathetic. And then he goes on to slag off the album and the lyrics in particular, and then finishes the article by saying, you've still got important things to say, so say them. Don't rely on cant and rigidity. Don't alienate, stimulate, like you used to. I thought that was nice. And Tony Tyler, you might recognise as being one half of Karen Tyler, who wrote the famous Karen Tyler Beatles illustrated record. So here he is a few months later reviewing Red Rose Speedway, and this is worth checking out because it says, where shall I start from? At the time of the split, there were those who doubted whether he could ever make a good record again without the edgy brilliance of John Lennon to offset his more melodic, face it, more overtly middle class, tunesmith aspirations. The fact that ducks on the wall can sometimes be appealing quite escaped McCartney's many critics, who, if truth be known, were more incensed at Paul's legal actions at the time than at his music, and they fastened their prejudices accordingly. So with John Lennon cast in the role of working class hero, brackets when he's even more lower middle than Paul, and with the anti-bourgeois chic that then prevailed, Paul McCartney lost out all down the line. Well, folks, this time Paul has really done it. He's really made a nice record. Certainly Red Rose Speedway is lightweight. Sure, it has no intellectual posture, but with all the current heaviness and after me the apocalypse brain studs around, I for one am bloody pleased to discover a lightweight record that not only fails to alienate, but actually succeeds in impressing via good melodic structure, excellent playing and fine production. It altogether makes my day. Have you ever read a more positive review of Red Rose Speedway in your life? I think that's great. And then just to contrast, and this is the same guy we're talking about, Tony Tyler, Material World, a couple of months later, in the same magazine, NME. There was a time when I considered George Harrison the finest packaged object since frozen pizza. I marvelled at the economy of his guitar breaks. I gasped at the way his phrases underscored a subtle vocal point that either Jowl or Paul had just made. His tonalities shriveled me. The very quiver of his Chet Atkins pick set me aflame with admiration. I walked tall with my idol. All this has changed. All things must pass. I'm not sure when I first began mentally to assign George the title of world's most boring man. The suspicion may have crept in with the dire ennui making all things must pass. But the unworthiness of my heretical thoughts smote home around the time of the Bangladesh concerts, which we all applauded like Billy-O made peace signs to each other about and then completely forgot. I mean, how can you slag off a guy who can get together a thing like that? Just watch me. And then he goes on to slag off the album, and he even hates Give Me Love. I mean, Karen Tyler were famous for hating all things, well, not hating, but thinking All Things Must Pass was boring. I mean, I don't agree, but it's actually refreshing to see people stick up for Paul and actually have a go at John and George, because it wasn't all one-sided in those early days following the split, in my opinion. So I remember outside MPL in 1987, there was one time when I was lucky enough to meet Paul quite a few times that year. When he came out, I handed him a review which I'd written of Red Rose Speedway. And he got his pen and got my pen or got his pen and went to sign it. And I said, no, it's a review, it's for you. And he goes, a review? That's all I need. And then he got into the car with John Hamill driving and drove back to Sussex with his review in my review in his hand. I like to think he read it on the way home, but anyway, I'm not particularly proud of that review. It was not a great piece of work. It was a bit pretentious, and I remember slagging off the la 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 chorus of Little Lamb Dragonfly and stuff like that. But anyway, that was just a little story there. Also going on this month, which the public were unaware of, is in Los Angeles, John, George and Ringo were in the studio together recording I'm the Greatest, the John track for the upcoming Ringo album. So that was actually 1973 turned out to be a very joyous year for Beatles fans, because you had so many albums come out, not only these two I've mentioned, and the Red and the Blue from the Beatles, but also later in the year, Mind Games, Band on the Run, and the Ringo album. So pretty rich pickings for that year. And someone was asking what we would like from the upcoming 50th anniversary of Material World, if we get it. Well, I would like sort of the stripped down versions without the strings to see what they would sound like. There's not a great deal of unreleased material, I don't think, from those sessions, but you never know. Maybe he did an early version of So Sad because that was written at the time. I'd also like to see proper musician credits, such as whether Pete Ham played on this album. Bobby Whitlock says he played on it, and he received a gold disc for it, so he must have played on it. So I'd like to see that corrected, unlike with All Things Must Pass, which was lacking in that respect. So yeah, Material World and Red Rose Speedway, two of my all-time favourite solo Beatles albums, and very contrasting. I mean, you can imagine why the Beatles were not together in '73 with Paul coming out with the stuff on Red Rose Speedway and George in pretty much 100% spiritual mode. But it's wonderful music either way, and it just depends which mood you're in as to which one you're gonna go for on a particular day. So that was me looking back to April 1973. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.